Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Good morning in Australia, and it's evening here in New York City, where I'm talking to you from. My name is Santiago Lyon. I head up advocacy and education for the Content Authenticity Initiative. My background is in journalism. I'm a second-generation lifelong journalist. I spent most of my career at the Associated Press, where I was the vice president in charge of photography for almost 15 years, overseeing the AP's global photo report. And prior to that, I was a photographer in the field for 20 years, including a decade spent covering war and conflict around the world. I photographed 8 wars on 4 continents, and my commitment to truth and authenticity as a result runs very deep. So I'm delighted to be with you here today to introduce the Content Authenticity Initiative, take you through it, a quick overview, and then I'll be introducing the moderator, and she will in turn introduce the panelists. So without further ado, let me tell you about the Content Authenticity Initiative. This was started by Adobe in late 2019, really in response to this perennial problem of mis and disinformation that we see every day in the news. From the get-go, we decided that this should be an open source initiative, that all the work that we do around this initiative will be available for anybody and everybody to use, including Adobe's business competitors. More recently, of course, we've seen the phenomenon of generative AI with images like this that were making the rounds not so long ago and fooling a lot of people. And that's added impetus to our work and elevated the importance of it for many people. Our membership has grown significantly since those early days in late 2019, where we had just a few members. Now we're past 1,700 members, and you can see on the left some of the major media partners who are involved, both news agencies and consumer-facing organizations. And on the right, you can see some of the major technology players who are also involved. And we think that it's precisely the weight and heft of the community around the Content Authenticity Initiative that will give us a chance of making this work and bringing value to consumers and news organizations and people the world over, helping to keep the internet safe in the face of an increasingly confused media landscape. When we took a look at the landscape in the fight against mis and disinformation, we identified 4 main areas, starting with detection, which involves uploading suspect files to programs that look for telltale signs of manipulation. We deliberately decided not to get involved in the detection game, in part because it's not scalable, it's not particularly accurate, and it's invariably an arms race with bad actors staying one step ahead of the latest detection software. Instead, we chose to focus on 3 other areas. Policy, which involves briefing policymakers and lawmakers around the world to make sure that they're up to speed with the latest technologies and what's going on and what's coming around the corner, and offering advice. Education, which is focused on media literacy and consumer literacy. And to that end, we're creating a robust suite of free media literacy materials aimed at middle school students, high school students, and university students. But what we're really focused on for the purpose of tonight's event is this notion of provenance. And so what do we mean by that in this context? We're really talking about the basic trustworthy facts about the origins of digital content, whether images, video, audio recordings, or other file formats, and showing the viewer where and how the files were created, what changes might have been made to them along their journey from creation through editing and onto publication, and then sharing some or all of that information with the viewer to help get transparency and give them an authentic view into what the content they're looking at actually is. I'll quickly run through how this works. We've divided the work up into 4 main areas, starting with capture. Here, we're working with hardware manufacturers to integrate this technology into their devices at production, meaning in the not too distant future, when you buy a camera or a smartphone, the goal is that it would come out of the box with CAI technology installed on it, and then you as the user could turn it on or off, depending on what the default setting is. What this does is it secures the valuable metadata that most devices currently generate, EXIF, XMP, IPTC data, which has a lot of very useful information, but that is not very secure. It's easy to hack into. So the first thing that we do is secure all of those data fields. Then we move into the editing phase where we integrate this technology into editing tools, both Adobe and non-Adobe tools, given the open source nature of this. And what happens here is that any changes that are made to a file in the editing process, let's say in the case of a photograph, you darken it, lighten it, tone it, crop it, add something, subtract something, each of those actions would be captured as a secure layer of metadata, which would then accompany the file on the next stage of its journey, which is typically publishing. And here we're working with publishers and CMS manufacturers and publishing systems to maintain the CAI metadata throughout their platforms. Most metadata, as you're probably aware, gets stripped off of files routinely. By maintaining it, it allows us to share some or all of it with the viewer and thus give them a look into the provenance information. And we call these secure layers of metadata content credentials, and they can be viewed at any point in a piece of content's journey. What about AI? All output from Adobe's generative AI offering Firefly is labeled as such and has been from the get-go, clearly stating that the content was created with a generative AI tool. And as a result of that, what we're seeing is that other major generative AI providers are also starting to label their output in the interests of transparency. And then lastly, we're working on a label that will enable creators to label their content "do not train" so that it isn't used in AI data training sets, which is an area of some controversy. Underlying the entire work of the Content Authenticity Initiative is another organization we set up with some partners, the likes of Intel, Microsoft, and others. This is the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, or the C2PA. This is a standards organization that sits within the Linux Foundation, with Adobe on the steering committee and chairing the technical working group. And in January of last year, we released a version 1 of our technical specification. We're currently on a version 1.3. The reason this is important is because this open technical standard underpins all the work. So one way to think about it is the C2PA is the architectural organization making the blueprints, and the Content Authenticity Initiative is the construction company building open source tools based on that standard, which are available on GitHub for developers to do what they will with, and at the same time are also incorporated into Adobe products. So that's a quick overview of the Content Authenticity Initiative. And now I'd like to introduce tonight's moderator, Dr. Anne Kruger. Anne co-founded CrossCheck at RMIT University in January 2023. CrossCheck is a collaborative initiative of international verification experts, many of whom were pioneers in open source intelligence techniques and practice preemptive solutions to promote information integrity. CrossCheck provides B2B guidance and training to newsrooms, community stakeholders, and policymakers. Anne is a subcommittee board member for Australia's first Misinformation and Disinformation Regulatory Code of Practice and was co-chief investigator during the code's development. She previously worked at First Draft for nearly 4 years and was an anchor at CNN in Hong Kong during the SARS epidemic. She also established a verification lab at the University of Hong Kong, collaborating with technologists in 2014 as part of her PhD. In 2021, Anne and her team at First Draft were granted UNESCO's International Program for the Development of Communication grant, for which they wrote the handbook Verification, Monitoring, and Responsible Reporting in an Age of Information Disorder, a guide for practitioners in Southeast Asia. So welcome, Anne, and I'll hand it over to you to introduce the other panelists and take us on our journey tonight.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Santiago. Really appreciate that. And yes, welcome to our international guests. We've got people from New York, New Jersey to New Zealand. And on behalf of those of us in Australia, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on the lands on which we are joining today and working. So I was fortunate in 2019 to begin working with Dr. Claire Wardle at First Draft, now Brown University. And First Draft supported a lot of that early research into content authenticity that Santiago introduced there. And we carry on the mission at CrossCheck now as an affiliate of Claire's and Brown University. We approach content authenticity with 3 things in mind. So firstly, rather than playing this game of whack-a-mole, we want consumers to be able to make an informed decision about media, where it came from, what it is, who made it. Secondly, as humans, we all make subconscious judgments created from previous experiences and instincts. And these heuristics really affect what we trust. So in terms of how content authenticity can support this, we think of trust as being between humans and trust signals. So this could be, for example, labels that should be carried along through the media, no matter where it goes. And finally, we want to encourage creators to be able to get credit for their work and to think about their role and responsibility as well when it comes to providing transparency for their audiences, because they really are influencers. In a moment, I'll introduce you to each of our panel members, and then just to explain the run of the show, we'll hear more from each of them about their work and how that relates to content authenticity. And then at the end, we'll have time for questions, and you can do that using the chat feature in Zoom. As Santiago mentioned, at CrossCheck, we take a preemptive approach as verification and OSINT pioneers. I'm still getting used to being called a pioneer, but I guess I've been in this area now for 10 years, having started in traditional journalistic roles. But we've really learned over the years the importance of supporting journalists, policymakers, and community leaders. And we do this via our membership to CrossCheck, which is basically a Slack group at the moment. And at the moment, we're very busy giving daily advice on the Voice referendum in Australia and the upcoming election for New Zealand. Both, for some reason, just happen to be held on the same weekend in October. So there you go. But I'm very much looking forward to today's discussions and just how we can think about linking all of this to support our media executives that are on the call today and the policy leads that are also listening in on Zoom today. So thank you all very much for your time. I am delighted to introduce my two co-panelists, Ariel Bogle and Ron Haviv. Ariel Bogle is an investigative journalist, a name that's known well throughout Australia, with a focus on technology, extremism, and internet policy. Now, Ariel recently joined The Guardian Australia as an investigations reporter. Previously, she was a technology reporter at the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where she contributed to programs across the entire network. Her reporting has also been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Australian Financial Review, and Slate, among many others. Ariel will today reflect on her investigations into the financing of far-right extremist groups, and as such, the implications for content authenticity needs. So welcome, Ariel. Delighted to have you, as I mentioned, at this very busy time in Australia and New Zealand. Thank you for finding the time. And also we have Ron Haviv. Now, Ron is an Emmy-nominated filmmaker, award-winning photojournalist, and co-founder of the photo agency 7, dedicated to documenting conflict and raising human rights issues around the globe. He's also the co-founder and a director of the nonprofit 7 Foundation, which concentrates on documentary projects and provides free visual journalism education. Ron has produced an unflinching record of the injustices of war, covering over 25 conflicts, and his photography has had singular impact. Ron's work in the Balkans will be a large part of his focus today. So welcome, and thank you, Ron, for joining us from New York. Now, just to set the scene a little bit, in particular for our viewers from Australia and New Zealand, I just wanted to think about the need for content authenticity tools in our part of the world. It seemed to go unnoticed quite a lot here in the past decade, even though Australia was responsible for some of the early global hoax videos that went viral, say back from about 2014, thanks to editing techniques that viewers just couldn't pick. Think things like, I recall seeing hawks picking up snakes dropped on barbecues. I mean, you can't get any more Australian than that, I suppose. But people swimming face to face with sharks, people believing it, millions and millions of followers and comments thinking it was real. But now, given the explosive interest in generative AI and the growing sense of urgency from recent times where vulnerable groups are getting targeted, there's been much more attention. So, for example, there's been a rapid development in policy regulation and planning in Australia. And from the conferences I attend, there's still a demand, though, for tangible tools and answers to help solve these big challenges over ethics, over consequences if we don't focus on authenticity. As I mentioned, Australia's focused very much at the moment on the Voice to Parliament referendum. It's a lot. It's got everything from Facebook ads using AI-generated presenters to anti-voice pamphlets misusing Aboriginal artwork when featuring a digitally altered image, to videos from over 2 years ago that have recently been edited to sow division as if they're currently related to the voice, and they're not. And while this is happening, of course, those cryptocurrency scams are stepping it up a notch, using artificially generated audio dubbed over television presenters, their segments, to change their words and give the impression that business billionaires are endorsing their advertised schemes. So there's a couple of challenges to think about. And as we hear from our panelists in a moment, I think this is just a narrative to keep in mind. Think in terms of the liar's dividend. When we think of deep fakes, how easy it is for some people in power to say, oh no, that's not real, that's a deep fake. This is the liar's dividend. And ultimately, as well as the personal harms experienced by those targeted communities, the biggest threat from deep fakes is that they can undermine further public trust in news media and politicians, as well as virally spread the highly unbelievable misinformation as well. Of course, the nature of deep fakes is problematic because people are less critical of visual misinformation compared to memes. Misinformation in deep fakes can be even more damaging, as videos can be more believable and subversive. Research shows humans have been shown to struggle to distinguish between real and fake videos. But what about data deficits? So this is when there isn't enough credible information to meet demand and people are searching for the answers. And often a lack of labels will create a kind of data deficit, ushering in speculation. Whereas, we want people to know what the credible information is. For example, from the photos and videos and images that Santiago mentioned and that our panelists will be speaking about as well, we want people to be able to tell what is credible information. And when there's a data deficit, rumours, speculation and misinformation are much more likely to spread. Often this will also occur in the comments, with viewers offering their guesses as to whether or not it was manipulated with AI. It could also occur within news articles, blogs, or on separate social media posts. So that's a few things just to set the scene for Australia and some of the challenges as we look to the solutions as well. So without any further ado, I would like to turn to Ariel Bogle. Now, Ariel, you're a respected technology reporter globally, and we've had many dealings over the past few years with your work as an OSINT investigator as well, looking into the provenance of information. I'm sure you're quite familiar with that broad brushstroke of Australia that I gave, but you've also studied, I guess, the dark side of things when it comes to far-right extremism. And I'd just like to hand you now to tell us a bit more about what you've focused on and your observations and concerns when it comes to manipulated content in these spaces. So thank you, Ariel.
Thanks, Anne, and thanks so much for having me for this opportunity. I mean, there's going to be some great discussion, I think, about photojournalism, verification, provenance, so I'll leave that to the next panelist. But I think I'll just touch on what I'm seeing in some of the spaces I monitor that you mentioned. So some of these far-right extremist spaces, some of the conspiracy theory communities that have built up around the pandemic, but also now around the voice referendum here in Australia, and also a bit around political advertising. And the context really is this Voice to Parliament referendum happening in Australia currently. So for people not familiar, in Australia, like a referendum to change the constitution is just a yes or no question. So it's an election, but without that typical sort of party divide where you're voting for a particular candidate, you're being asked a question. But in Australia, and it's no surprise that it becomes highly politicized, and it does in some ways become also a referendum on political attitudes, as well as many other factors. So quite an emotional space in which content is being distributed, and that we're having to face some of these verification challenges. So this first slide that's up is a chart I made a few years ago, actually, when I did a report looking at how the far right in Australia fundraises, what online platforms they use to do so. And I thought I'd just start with this because it shows obviously a few ways people fundraise: Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies and things there, PayPal, Patreon, etc. But there's that layer in there that's about video content. So Odyssey, YouTube, of course, BitChute, DLive, Trovo, Entropy, and of course, Telegram is a really important platform. And this is the ecosystem in which visual material gets traded these days. And as a reporter or a researcher trying to track it, it's a lot of platforms to be across, obviously. But I think if you're trying to engage with verification and track how things move, you need to be aware of these platforms, how they operate, their kind of affordances, and also the different cultures that exist within them. Of course, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram are really still central platforms, and that is where the majority of people still are. But material travels to these other spaces too, which have different attitudes to, say, censorship, quote unquote, the ideas of authenticity. Some of these platforms like BitChute, Odyssey, their point is in some ways to be a place where things do not get removed, unlike some of the major tech platforms like Facebook and Instagram. But I think that a culture does build around visual content, which affects our verification challenge on these platforms as well, and just something we need to monitor. So if we just move to the next slide. So this is a really helpful chart that I took from Britt Paris and Joan Donovan's report from a few years ago, Deep Fakes and Cheap Fakes. It helps me, I think about that sort of spectrum, because things may not be all the way on one side or all the way on the other. I mean, there are, of course, increasingly convincing generative AI video and imagery that Santiago showed earlier. But at least here in Australia, if I'm thinking about the Voice to Parliament referendum, we haven't seen much on that far deep fake end. Really, I've been in the trenches with the cheap fakes, essentially. This is content that is real video that's been filmed at some point in time that now has been removed from its context. Maybe it's been slightly edited, slowed down, pauses on people's face when they're making the most, strange face to sort of encourage the perspective that they are somehow evil or, lying to the public. So really, it's that far cheap fake end, recontextualizing imagery, slowing down, using those basic effects, which most people can access and use. So speeding, slowing down, adding color filters to give a kind of dingy or sinister aspect to videos, things like this. So that's really where we're still seeing what we're still really struggling with, I think, in Australia in the context of the Voice to Parliament referendum. And even if I think back to our federal election in last year, still it was really that cheap fake end. And I'm sure we can have a great discussion about generative AI, but in terms of the Australian political landscape at the moment, certainly it's this cheap fake end of the spectrum here that Britt Paris and Joan Donovan have offered us. So just go to the next slide. So yes, as I said, we're seeing like a lot of content that is quote unquote, was truly recorded at one point in time, but has been chopped up, removed from context, etc. And one thing I've really observed in, say, far right spaces on Telegram, especially, which are opposing the Voice with all kinds of really hateful rhetoric around it, because it is about Australia's Indigenous people. They are taking a really hateful approach to discussing the Voice. They're taking content that was filmed at one point in time and then using it for a purpose for which it was not originally created. So in Australia, there's this question about Australia Day, which is the day of when the first fleet arrived in Australia. It's for Indigenous people, a day of great tragedy when the British arrived in Australia with the first boats of convicts and others. So there's this debate about, sort of whether Australia Day is a day for pride of Australia, whether it should be moved. And there's traditionally protests on that day, but footage from those protests is being used as part of the Voice debate, which is not quite fair, because the Voice to Parliament could have a say on Australia Day, but won't be able to unilaterally move that date. It's an advisory body. So it's that subtle tweak of content that displays Indigenous people in a certain light then being kind of traded. And that's really what I'm seeing a lot of video footage, slowed down, edited to make it look slightly more sinister potentially, and then it's sort of being traded as the evidence that people are looking for to vote no, or to show what the voice is really about, because if there's a lot of attendant conspiracy theories also being shared around the voice. This happens with audio content too. That post there on the right, Thomas Mayo, who's an advocate for the voice, has become a pretty significant target of misinformation. There was some footage, some audio being shared in which he allegedly told an Indigenous man to sit down and shut up at a public meeting, which didn't happen. No one was told to shut up. And in any case, Thomas Mayo did not say anything to this man, but it got shared in the media. This allegation got shared in the media, and then some of the clips got cut up and shared on social media in a way that was incorrect around Thomas Mayo. So that was sort of traded in a way that lacked context and also manipulated the truth there. I thought I'd also just add this picture in the middle because it's kind of interesting. I follow on TikTok a TikTok account that essentially just used generative AI to make fake movie trailers, fake movie posters. And I thought I'd just throw this in there because I think sometimes when we're talking about generative AI or deep fakes or these issues with image verification, we really think about it in that sort of hard-edged journalism context, in the context of environmental disaster, in terms of the context of war crimes, trying to track down conspiracy theories and misinformation. But I just want to point out that I think literacy around this topic is really important for all journalists at this point, because this is the kind of material that could get shared, fake pictures of celebrities, fake cultural content that arts journalists and things like this, people like this will also at some point need to identify. So I thought I'd just throw that in there too, in case we want to have a discussion about that too, to ensure that the education around these topics is as broad as possible, because I really do think all parts of the newsroom need to have some level of fluency in spotting this kind of material these days. So if we can go to the next slide. I thought it just, for any journalists on the call, I thought I would just throw in some of these basic tools. So Santiago, I know, is talking about a really sophisticated new approach to verification and metadata, which is really important. But I just wanted to throw out these old favorites, I guess. So these are tools that I turn to a lot. So RevEye is a reverse image search tool. If you install it, you can right click and then search an image across multiple image search engines at once. These are still the old faithfuls that I still really turn to, as I was saying, especially in this current context with the referendum in Australia, because the content really is out of context. Imagery, video, audio, I'm still having to just use these old tools rather than trying to get into the grips of GAN faces or anything like that. And also YouTube Data Viewer is really helpful for that YouTube content as well. And I think we're going to talk about it too, but just to think back to that first slide where I showed all the different platforms where visual content might be shown or traded, I just wanted to raise, and something we can get more into, is how marks of authenticity, or some of the ways we might attempt to verify content, can become part of the narrative itself. So I'm thinking about the way that anti-vaccine communities started to take it as a badge of honor when their content was fact-checked on Facebook and had that kind of sort of blur, do you want to see this image, sort of screen applied to it. It showed that they were, quote, onto the truth and were being censored by the deep state, etc. So I just want to flag that as a potential risk with any of these kinds of projects, that these markers of verification sort of enter into the public debate and become symbols of something themselves. And, that's something that we're all going to have to contend with, even when we approach these projects with absolutely the best of intentions. So thanks, Anne.
Thank you so much, Ariel. That was just brilliant context for what we're going through in Australia now, the challenges, and just, how to approach the solutions. I think very relevant, and relevant for the CAI tools as well. Well, we're all aware of the importance of photographic evidence from reporters on the ground documenting the war in Ukraine currently. So images that were plagued with disinformation and propaganda, but we're all familiar, to the dedicated work of journalists, that the authenticity of the provenance of those images have been verified and will be essential as the international community calls for accountability. Now, this echoes similar outcries from 30 years ago. I'd like to invite Ron Haviv to share part of his journey and what his uptake of technology means for us now. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, Anna. I appreciate it. I'm pleased to be able to kind of present a perspective from a visual content provider. And one of the key things is this idea that photojournalists want the audience to believe and to trust, and more importantly, act on the images they see. It predates, certainly predates AI and even predates Photoshop. It is the core reason why every generation of photographers has picked up a camera. My documentation of a war crime in Bosnia of well-armed Serbian paramilitaries executing unarmed Muslim civilians some 30 years ago is a perfect example of an image that needs to be believed then and also really to be believed now. So the methodology that is endorsed and developed by CAI can and should be used, even for an analog image so long ago, to create a digital provenance that has to exist today to fight against a permissive and ever-strengthening idea of revisionism and basically the idea of fake news.
More. If we as a community of visual journalists lose the trust of our audience, they just say like, oh, that's been photoshopped. The tragedy becomes the stories of these people are not believed.
So that authentication process that I did in conjunction with Starling Lab and Rolling Stone is important. And it's important to also understand that the images that we're seeing, they're not just made up of pixels, but they represent real people whose lives are affected by the image that you see. Here's a clip from an upcoming documentary called Biography of a Photo that I'm co-directing with Lauren Walsh about the photograph. Here, the daughter of one of the victims speaks to the impact of the image.
Mojih roditelja, mog brata, mojih komšija, prijatelja nema više. Ostale su samo uspomene i ova slika. Nadam se da će jednog dana da se bar iko sa ove fotografije osudi, optuži.
Kada bih htio u jednoj riječi opisati šta je rat, moja prva misao bi bila ova fotografija.
So while kind of this idea, this fake news, deep fakes, etc., has become kind of like a catch kind of phrase, to allow somebody to say something like this is fake news is an insult. And in this case, it's an insult to those who died. This is incredibly serious what we're talking about, and it has ramifications that go all over the place. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron. That's very moving video and images that we've seen there. And thank you to both of our panelists for presenting your work to us today. Both of you, I think, are incredibly brave in your approach too. I just want to just start with a couple of follow-up questions, and just a reminder to our audience that the chat feature is enabled. You can start to pop some questions in there. But for the moment, I'd just like to ask you, Ron, just relating back to the lies dividend that I mentioned before, how dangerous a threat is this? I mean, given that, in the decades since that iconic photo of that swinging boot of the soldier, there have been politicians, warlords, bloggers, as we saw, just challenging the veracity of your images, and even recently.
Yeah, this is a particular photograph that has had some sort of impact from the day that it was created in 1992, even as recently as last month, where it was used in a war crimes trial to indict, actually to convict two Serbian politicians of war crimes. And this is very key, right? If these photographs are not believed, if they're disputed, if they are said to be propaganda, and more people believe that, we wind up, one, with a lack of evidence. We wind up with this idea of not learning from the photography. Having spent much of last year in Ukraine, it is incredibly, aside from depressing as a whole of what's happening in Ukraine, I'm photographing the same things that I photographed 30 years ago in the former Yugoslavia, for instance. And it makes you wonder, the photographs have to have this ability to hopefully educate and better the world. If they're continuously being bombarded and being said, like, oh no, that's taken by the other side, we have no responsibility for that, it's fake, it's fake, it's fake, and look what I can do on my phone. I can create the same photograph and say it's this or that. And when photographs are taken out of context. So for instance, this particular photograph, when the first part of the war in Ukraine started in 2014, a very well-known Russian blogger took the photograph and simply changed the caption. Said that the victims were Russians, the perpetrators were Ukrainians, posted it to his audience, it went viral throughout Russia. Now, if you show that photograph to an average Russian, if they recognize it, they're going to say, yeah, this is a war crime against Russians. Done by Ukrainians. This is why we're fighting against Ukraine.
And just give us some more details, if you don't mind, about how the actual technology works. That iconic photo, as we've heard, has been misused. But just tell us then, if we see that popping up, in future, how can the CAI system that was built stay with that? And or move with that image? Just give us a little bit more of an insight into that.
I mean, this is really more of a detailed question for Santiago, but for me, basically, what I'm looking for is a stamp of approval, a symbol, something that through, and this will take a while, through the education of the audience to be media literate, to understand that when they see a blue check mark next to a photograph, it's been vetted, it's been verified, they can trust it. And that's the only type of imagery that they should take into account. And this is within the world of documentary and photojournalism, not talking about portraiture and so on. That's another conversation. But the audience has to believe it. We as photographers, as an industry, with Photoshop, we've created photographs, we've made up photographs. We've already damaged the relationship between the photograph and the audience. And now we're on the kind of the last legs. Once the audience does not believe what they are seeing, or only believe something that's in their own echo chamber, it's finished. There will be no way to understand truthfully what is happening in the world.
Yeah. And Ariel, I'll move to you. We'll get Santiago can answer some more of those detailed questions in a moment too. But Ariel, I just want to ask you, going back to your overview that you gave, and you've really looked into some of the deepest, darkest spaces, and including an area with far right extremists that the Australian security authorities say is high priority. So what's your biggest concern regarding content authenticity if we just allow things to continue as business as usual?
I mean, not even in that far right context. I just think in the general sort of media consumption of the public, I guess my key concern is the effect of the deluge. I mean, this is not original to say that consumption of media across all the social platforms, even 24-hour television news channels, these all this consumption happens in the kind of context of an absolute deluge. So the ability for people to slow down and check is highly reduced. So I think that's really why this cheap fakes really remain so effective, because they just happen in as one scrolls by. You consume them, you flick on to the next video. There's not that pause to allow for the questioning of content, or even the sort of investigation or the use of like a authenticity symbol or anything like this. So I just guess in general, my concern really is the that sort of overwhelming deluge of content, and how we figure out ways to help the public identify and verify images while they're having to consume so many at once. So I don't pretend to have the answer to that, but that really is where I see the challenge.
And well, to the two of you, I mean, I have to recognize the work that you're both doing. We've heard from Ron and also Santiago as well, coming from war zones. And also Ariel, I know that just viewing online content as well is just as mentally draining as well, and that can actually have a physical effect too. So I just want to ask you both, this is not pleasant work. So what drives you to keep going? What is your passion here? Ron, I might start with you.
To hold people accountable. I think that it needs to be done. To hold the actors, the bad actors, accountable without question. But also, there's more than that. There's more responsibility. I think that, especially where, let's say, using again this photograph from Bosnia, which represented this idea of ethnic cleansing, the first kind of documentation of that in the Bosnian War, was basically ignored by the world until it wound up being used as evidence in the War Crimes Tribunal and so on. The people that ignored it, the public, but also the leaders that were elected by that public, people that did nothing, should also be held accountable. That's one of the roles of that photography can do. And so it is this small, very small attempt of mine to play a role of trying to improve things and protect people to some degree. But I think that for myself and Santiago, when he was doing it, and all our colleagues, I think we're all kind of within that kind of sphere, wanting to have some sort of positive impact. And but it's part of a chain. And the work needs to be then handed off to the public. It needs to put pressure on the politicians and so on and so on. And so when you break that chain, when you break that trust, then we're in great danger.
And Ariel, I'm hearing from you a lot today about this broader education as well for our democracy. Is that what keeps you going? Are you striving to try to improve that, or something else?
Yeah, I mean, I really echo Ron there in terms of the accountability piece. I think that's what most, every journalist should be striving for, and many do. The holding of people with power to account. That can be all sorts of power, of course, like financial and political, but there are, even on a social level, which groups have more power over others in framing the narratives we tell about ourselves. And that's really relevant in these election periods or this referendum period. The kind of narratives we are sharing and people are consuming will really shape how the country moves forward. So that's highly motivating, I suppose, helping identify and help people find and sort of skill up, I guess, in seeing where they might be getting manipulated, whether it be pure political emotional manipulation, which is, centuries old, or whether it is these new sort of audio-visual techniques that people are using to shape narratives.
Thank you. And Santiago, I might bring you back into the discussions as well. You mentioned earlier about your career and, how, you reflected upon that, and that, really drove you to focus on the provenance and what can be done, and, just the power of image. So I'm just keen for you to just elaborate a little more on how the CAI tools could be used and assist us in this part of the world. You've heard from Ariel about what we're dealing with at the moment, from the whole spectrum, cheap fakes to deep fakes. So I guess it's like, where do we start?
It's a good question. It's a very complex problem. And as I indicated at the beginning, it doesn't have a single, one single turnkey solution. It's a confluence of solutions being, provenance, obviously, but also media literacy as well as policy and detection to some degree on an ad hoc basis, but really focused on those first three. And so really when we try and define what success looks like for the Content Authenticity Initiative, it's really about ubiquity. It's about this notion of labeling content, not just news content, but all sorts of stuff that we see online where we take great leaps of faith every day based on our assumptions or context, but we don't really have any empirical evidence as to what we're looking at. So whether you're booking a holiday home on Airbnb or buying something online, you really are taking a leap of faith when it comes to the content that accompanies those transactions. And so this is a way of changing the landscape and making it more transparent through the use of these tools. But of course, that requires a change in habit, which I think Ariel alluded to. People are getting bombarded with so much content now. How are you going to encourage them to take a look at the provenance? And for some things, maybe it's not that important, but for other things, serious issues or, areas where people can be misled, it's hugely important. And that's where the media literacy part of it comes in. And so really, regardless of the region of the world, what we're looking to achieve through the Content Authenticity Initiative is adoption, whether it's by camera manufacturers, software manufacturers, news platforms, e-commerce, insurance industry, law enforcement industry, medical imagery, satellite imagery. There's a whole range of things where there's a real value for the consumer in understanding exactly what it is they're looking at, and that can be helped by the inclusion of the provenance data that we aspire to include.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for just, explaining everything so well and sharing your experiences. We're right on time now to start with some audience questions. And I've just been looking at the chat there. There's some fantastic questions coming through that relate exactly to some of the points that you've been making there. I'm actually going to start with one from Tiffany, who says, how do you see the best way to ensure your work is then verified, and would that be best handled from the moment of capture? So I suppose Santiago, this might be for
I mean, the provenance trail can begin at any point in the chain of provenance. It's perhaps most robust when it begins at capture, and that's why we're working with the camera and smartphone manufacturers to incorporate this technology into their devices at production. And the user can decide if they want to add these labels to their content in order to, assert the veracity of the content. But the provenance trail can also start retroactively. I mean, Ron's work around that picture from Bosnia is a great example of that. Here's a picture that was taken, 30 years ago. And what we're doing, or what he's been doing, is adding provenance information to the image in a digital form, which is where, analog images begin their digital journey. Obviously, this one has been around for a long time, but it's never too late to start a chain of provenance, even for archival material. Or it can be started during the editing process. You're in an editing program. You're making changes to an image. Perhaps your camera didn't have the provenance attached at the moment of capture, but you're able to attach information about what you did to the digital file after the fact, or even at the moment of publishing. We're working with some major publishers in the United States and Canada to see about adding provenance information, albeit lightweight or simple provenance information, at the moment of publication, to say this image came from the Wall Street Journal or the Globe and Mail or the BBC or whoever it is. So the provenance chain can really be initiated anywhere, but in the absence of any provenance chain, somewhere is better than nowhere.
Mm. I think that's answering a couple of questions I'm seeing there too about, Dennis asked about preserving provenance during digital, the photo metadata editing. So that's brilliant. I think that answers that well. Thank you. What about for mobile phones? Marshall has a question saying, the vast majority of images are from smartphones. George Floyd would not be remembered as he is now in the US, if not the world. without a video recorded by a bystander with a smartphone. What progress has been made there with the adoption of this protocol with smartphone makers?
So we're in conversations with everybody you'd expect us to be talking to, all of the major smartphone and camera manufacturers. Conversations are moving along, always in a forward positive motion at different pace according to each company or corporation's needs. But we're optimistic in the not too distant future we will see adoption by major smartphone manufacturers, which will address the question that was asked.
Right. And I just want to go back to something that Ariel's been talking about too with you. It's that news literacy training and the media literacy training. So it's for audiences, but also for the media as well. And Brian has a question there about, even though detection isn't one of the pillars that CAI is pursuing, or I guess not prioritizing, but why not include basic photo video alteration training in the curriculum of the education pillar? I imagine this is something that you've considered, though.
Yes, indeed. Our media literacy materials address those things. And, we talk about media literacy in sort of two different ways. We talk about classroom media literacy for young people, but then we also talk about consumer media literacy. So as this technology gets introduced by publishers and social media platforms over time, we'll be hopefully working with them to help them educate their viewers, their consumers, as to what these labels are, so that when you interact with a content credential icon that appears next to an image or a piece of video or whatever the file is, when you click on that little icon and it takes you to some provenance information, it's really important that the consumers of news media and other areas understand what that is and come to recognize it and know that, oh, look, that image has a little, CR for content credential logo on it. Let me click on that. And over time, as it becomes more ubiquitous and as consumers become more familiar with that little CR logo and interact with it, then what we anticipate is that it will become a recognizable interface for people to check things that are important to them or that they might have doubts about.
Yeah, and I want to sort of reiterate that from an Australian policy point of view, and just with my work having gone through the first misinformation and disinformation regulatory code and the updates to that, it does have provision in there for media literacy and news literacy. And I'm putting it out there to all those that might be listening in today. I would actually like to encourage that platforms, governments and stakeholders actually do build that up in, a bit more of a strategic pattern, in particular for adult media literacy. I feel like schools are a good captive audience. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in Australia there. That's my 2 cents worth as taking my moderator's moment there. But there was a question also from Mila saying, what benefits would content authenticity bring for brands and companies? I think this is a really good, we often think about, in terms of the news, the media, but also brands and companies and brands and risk to brands as well.
Interesting. Sorry to dominate the answers to some of these questions, but they seem technical or in nature or directly related to the initiative. But we've seen our community is growing very rapidly. 1,700 members and growing, and we just recently got a bunch of major advertising holding companies on board. So the likes of Publicis or WPP or Dentsu. These are companies that own dozens, scores of advertising agencies around the world who are tasked with advertising and by extension protecting brands. And so we're working with all of those companies to understand how to integrate this technology into the advertising world so that, if you see a product or a picture related to a brand, you'll be able to have some guarantees that that really is of that product or of that brand and not somebody attempting to imitate it or distort it in some way. So, like I said earlier, the notion of ubiquity here across a wide variety of sectors media companies, e-commerce, insurance, auditing, law enforcement, like I mentioned before. We think that there is a use for this. And when we look at it through that prism, we've realized the great leaps of faith that we take every day. We make these assumptions, and sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're not. But there's no real, thus far, empirical way of showing that. And this technology that we're developing and implementing, this open source technology, will surely help in those endeavors.
What about, there's a question, because we heard, from the panel about everything from cheap fakes to deep fakes. We've been talking about images, videos. There's a question from George asking, do you think the C2PA standard can work well on all modalities? So text, image, video, audio, etc., or does it vary from modality, one to another? And George asks, if so, which one can be the most challenging? It's a good question.
I think text is slightly more challenging because, things can be copied and pasted, and it's hard to track down the provenance right now of text. But, I imagine there will be a solution to that too. One of the things that we're actively exploring now, along with many other companies, is this notion of invisible watermarking. Typically when you say the word watermark, you think of some visible thing across a picture to prevent, screenshots or scraping of content. But there's a whole nother category of invisible watermarking out there, where you're able to embed useful information just in a few pixels of an image. And then what you're able to do, what we're working on, is linking that invisible watermarking back to the content credential. And so through the use of browser plugins that we're in the process of developing, it will be possible to inspect images on media browsers, regardless of whether the metadata has been maintained. Now, of course, it requires that the user use the plugin, but it's a super interesting area of technology, and one that, over time could potentially address things in the text world as well, in the same way that, printers have often the ability to embed information about the printer itself, which can then be used to determine, if documents are being leaked or shared. So, but the text area is a little bit more challenging than at the moment anyway, than the photo, video, or audio file formats that we're working on.
I've certainly seen that at the conferences I've been to as well. That's absolutely the case. Concerns about the text. We're pretty much at time. I just want to raise, I'll take it as comment. Ricky was talking about the laws and, whether or not governments and courts have fallen behind the tech. And this is the sort of thing that we have seen throughout modern history. It seems that the tech goes ahead, and then we have like a lot of data deficits, even in terms of just getting information to people as well. But, do we need to fix the law for this era too? I mean, I would say, from the Australian point of view, we're actually looking at, there are draft laws for more powers for the government as well. And, I think it's always going to be a game of catch up. And it's going to be very iterative from what I see. I'll throw it open to the floor if anyone else on the panel would like to comment about that, some of your experiences perhaps.
Well, I can say that. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I guess the legal question, just to put to the side, I do agree there's always a sense of catch up there. I think it's interesting, just from like a reporting perspective, that how these sort of authenticity marks can offer opportunities but also dangers. So I'm just thinking of how difficult it is because of the way that social media has so far stripped metadata out of images, so that if somebody shares a Twitter image, the metadata is stripped, and Twitter used to say that was for privacy reasons. Similarly on Facebook, which seems quite legitimate in terms of stripping the geographical location where it was taken, or potentially like the name of the person's iPhone who took the photo, etc. So on one hand, it would be super useful as a journalist to have that information. I also see the privacy concerns. And then from a kind of whistleblowing and leaking perspective, when materials are shared with watermarks built in and then shared without removing those watermarks, I'm thinking about an outlet in the United States that shared documents that had those printer ID codes still in the document, and that helped identify a whistleblower, just to raise those kinds of troubles to this sort of discussion, issues of privacy, protecting whistleblowers, and then just the desire for, of course, more information as a reporter always.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think there's a balance to be had in all of these things, and certainly in the technology that's inside of the Content Authenticity Initiative, it's customizable according to what the user wants to share or is comfortable sharing, because, as was indicated, there can be real threats and harms by sharing information inadvertently. Like if you're a journalist in a war zone, you wouldn't want to share your GPS coordinates, because we've seen that makes journalists targets with often fatal consequences. Or if you're a human rights defender working in a difficult environment, the last thing you want is your name to be inextricably associated with a piece of damning content denouncing a human rights abuse. So there is a balance to be had. The good news is that the C2PA technical specification allows for customization. And we're currently doing a lot of research around how different types of creators would like to see this technology implemented according to their needs. So journalists want a set of data points in content credentials that influencers and creators don't, and vice versa. So it's really about, I think, allowing users to customize it and then balancing those things against privacy concerns, so that this doesn't become weaponized.
That, and in conjunction, so yeah, with that customization and the media literacy is as an important part as well for audiences and everyone too, I think helps to balance all of that out. We are over time. We've gone over by 5 minutes, but I think we've touched on a lot of areas, a lot of challenges, solutions, and I just want to thank our panelists today for being brave, telling your stories, and just thank you so much for your passion in this area, and also the questions too about troubleshooting, so that we actually can have some real solutions here. So from me, I would just like to say again a special thank you to Ariel, Bogle, and Ron Haviv. I've really enjoyed working with you and learnt a lot from you throughout this process for setting up for today's panel. And a big thanks also to Santiago, and I'd just like to hand to you for the final words. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for taking part. Thank you to those attending for listening. Hopefully this has been interesting. I'd like to invite those who have attended this to join the Content Authenticity Initiative. This QR code will take you to our membership page, contentauthenticity.org. Membership of the CAI is completely free. There's a web form. You can join as an individual or as a company. And if you have any questions or would like a deeper briefing, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The goal here is really to grow the community, implement the technology, and through doing so, achieve the ubiquity that will indicate a successful implementation of this very valuable technology that we're developing. And with that, I'll sign off, and I wish everybody a good day, and hope to see you at one of our next events. Thank you very much.